In the dusty streets of Desert Thistle Valley, an old man sits quietly on his wooden porch, his weathered hands trembling as he rocks in his chair. The local troublemakers mock him daily, unaware that those shaking hands once belonged to the most feared marksman in the Arizona territory. They're about to learn that some legends never fade, they just get older. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Desert Thistle Valley, a small town nestled between towering red cliffs and endless stretches of desert sage. Every morning, like clockwork, Ezra McCready would settle into his creaking rocking chair on the front porch of his modest home. His silver hair gleamed in the morning light, and his worn boots showed the miles they'd traveled. To passers-by, he was just another old-timer living out his twilight years, watching the world go by through tired eyes. Most folks in town knew him as the quiet man who'd drift into Martha Williams' saloon every Thursday for a bowl of stew and a glass of water. He never touched whiskey anymore, though nobody knew why. The children would sometimes stop by his porch for the hard candies he kept in his pocket, and he'd tell them stories about the desert, which plants could heal, which could harm, and how to read the weather in the clouds. Young Jimmy Foster, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with a fascination for the Old West, was particularly fond of the elderly man. He'd sit cross-legged on the porch steps, listening to Ezra's soft-spoken tales about the land. What Jimmy didn't know, what nobody in town knew, was that the gentleness in Ezra's voice masked decades of stories that would make even the bravest men shudder. The peace of desert. Thistle Valley was shattered the day Wade the Snake Harrison and his gang rode into town. They were the kind of men who mistook kindness for weakness, the sort who'd rather take than earn. Wade, with his silver-studded gun belt and expensive black hat, carried himself like he owned every inch of ground he stood on. His right-hand man, Jasper Thorne, was a powder keg of temper with tobacco-stained teeth and quick hands. The youngest of their trio, Timothy Brown, was barely into his 20s, trying to prove himself with every breath he took. It didn't take long for them to notice the old man on the porch. To them, he was the perfect target, someone who couldn't fight back, someone who'd lived long enough to gather a few valuables worth taking. They didn't know about the carefully oiled Colt period, 45 hidden beneath the blanket across his lap, or the fact that his trembling hand steadied the moment he wrapped them around a gun grip. The first confrontation came on a Tuesday morning. Wade and his boys had spent the night drinking in Martha's saloon, and their mood was sour from losing at cards. They stopped in front of Ezra's porch, the dust from their boots settling on his freshly swept boards. "Well, look what we have here," Wade drawled, spitting tobacco juice near Ezra's feet. "The town's official sidewalk warmer. Must be real important work you're doing there, old-timer." Ezra's eyes, still sharp despite his years, took in every detail, the way Wade's gun hung slightly low on his right hip, how Jasper's left boot had a loose spur, and how young Timothy's trigger finger twitched nervously. He said nothing, just kept rocking. "Are you deaf as well as old?" Jasper stepped closer, his spurs jingling discordantly. "The boss is talking to you." "I hear just fine," Ezra replied softly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age. "And I see just fine, too. I see 3 men who ought to be moving along." Timothy laughed, a harsh sound trying to match his companion's cruelty. "Or what, Grandpa? You'll bore us to death with stories about the good old days?" Sheriff Thomas Palmer watched the scene unfold from across the street, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He knew Ezra's history, one of the few who did, and he saw the almost imperceptible change in the old man's posture. It was subtle, the way a rattlesnake's warning is subtle to those who don't know what to look for. Martha Williams stepped out of her saloon, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd known Ezra for years, and had seen the old newspaper clippings he kept folded in his Bible. She knew what those trembling hands had done in their prime. "Boys," she called out, "your breakfast is getting cold." Wade turned, annoyance flickering across his face. "We'll be there when we're good and ready, woman." But he stepped back from the porch anyway, making a show of adjusting his gun belt. "We'll continue this conversation later, old man. Maybe see what kinds of treasures you've got tucked away in that little house of yours." As they swaggered away, young Jimmy Foster emerged from behind a water barrel where he'd been watching. "Mr. McCready," he whispered, climbing onto the porch. "Why'd you let them talk to you like that?" Ezra's eyes, the color of faded denim, crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Jimmy, my boy, there's something you need to learn about this world. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is let others think they're stronger than him. But remember this, it's not about who makes the most noise, it's about who knows when to make their move." He reached into his pocket for a piece of candy, but his hand brushed against something else, an old tin star, its silver surface dulled with age, the words Arizona Rangers still barely visible beneath the tarnish. He let it lie there, a reminder of days long past, days that might not stay in the past much longer. The following days in Desert Thistle Valley carried a weight of anticipation, like the heavy air before a storm. Wade Harrison and his gang had made themselves at home in Martha's saloon, turning the once peaceful establishment into their personal kingdom. They'd push tables over for fun, harass the customers, and Martha could only watch as her regular patrons started staying away. Even the traveling salesmen who usually brought news and goods from other towns had begun to skip Desert Thistle Valley, sensing the dangerous shift in the town's atmosphere. Sheriff Palmer had tried to maintain order, but with only 2 deputies and a town council unwilling to risk confrontation, his options were limited. He'd seen towns fall this way before, good people staying quiet, bad men getting bolder until the very soul of the place withered away like a desert flower in drought. It was Thursday, and despite the growing tension in town, Ezra McCready maintained his routine. He made his way down the dusty street toward the saloon, his gait slow but purposeful. The morning sun cast long shadows behind him, and those who knew him well might have noticed he wasn't using his cane today. As he walked, he passed the general store where old Bill Thompson was sweeping his porch, pretending not to see the 3 horses tied outside Martha's place. "Morning, Ezra," Bill called out, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Might want to take your meal home today. Heard Martha's place is a bit crowded." Ezra tipped his hat but kept walking. A group of children playing marbles in the dirt stopped their game to watch him pass, their young faces showing concern. Jimmy Foster broke away from the group, running to catch up with the old man. "Mr. McCready," Jimmy whispered urgently, "Wade's been talking about you all morning. I heard him in the store. He said he's going to teach you some manners today." Ezra placed a weathered hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Thank you, son. Now run along home. This isn't going to be a place for children today." "Well, if it ain't the town's oldest resident," Wade called out as Ezra pushed through the saloon doors. The gang leader was sprawled in a chair, boots up on a table, while Jasper and Timothy played cards nearby. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat between them despite the early hour. "Come to grace us with more of your silence, old man?" Martha moved to serve Ezra his usual stew, but Wade's arm shot out, blocking her path. "Hold on there, Martha. Our friend here needs to learn some manners first. In my experience, respect is something you earn." The saloon had fallen silent, save for the nervous shuffling of feet and the distant ticking of the clock above the bar. 2 ranch hands sat nervously in the corner, while young Jimmy Foster, despite Ezra's warning, peeked through the window from outside. Sheriff Palmer was nowhere to be seen. He'd ridden out early to handle a dispute at the Peterson Ranch, though some suspected he'd chosen today for that task deliberately. "The only thing I'm here to earn," Ezra said softly, "is my Thursday stew." Timothy Brown laughed, showing his youth. "Maybe. You should earn it on your knees, Grandpa. Beg for it to be nice and proper." "Watch your mouth, Tim," Martha snapped, her patience finally breaking. "That man's been coming here longer than you've been alive." Wade stood, shoving his chair back. "Seems like everyone in this town needs a lesson in respect. Martha, why don't you step outside? This is men's business now." "It's all right, Martha," Ezra interrupted, his voice steady. He moved to the center of the room, and something in his stance made Wade's smile falter slightly. "You know, boys, my father taught me something important when I was young. He said there are two types of men in this world, those who command respect through fear, and those who earn it through their actions. And which type are you? Jasper sneered, standing up from his card game, tobacco juice staining his beard. I was both, at different times. Ezra's hands hung loose at his sides, no trace of their usual tremor. But these days I prefer to be neither. I just want my stew. Wade stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. You know what I think? I think you're full of tall tales and hot air. Men who wear something don't end up as nothing, old-timer. Some men choose to become nothing, Ezra replied. It's easier than living with being something. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that the gang couldn't quite grasp. Martha could, though. She'd seen the newspaper clippings, read the stories about the legendary Eagle-Eye McCready, the ranger whose shots never missed, whose quick draw had cleaned up 3 territories. The man who one day simply disappeared, leaving his badge and his legend behind. She remembered the day he'd first walked into her saloon 5 years ago, asking only for a quiet corner and a bowl of stew. She'd recognized him then, but honored his silent request for anonymity. Choice or not, Wade said, his hand resting on his gun, you're still nothing now, and nothing men eat when we say they can eat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next few moments seemed to stretch like molasses. Wade's hand tightened on his gun grip. Jasper moved to flank Ezra's left, while Timothy, eager to prove himself, actually drew his pistol. Outside, Jimmy Foster held his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the windowsill. Son, Ezra said to Timothy, not even turning to look at him, if you don't put that gun away, you'll never get another chance to draw one. There was something in his voice, not a threat, but a certainty, that made Timothy's hand shake. The young man looked to Wade for guidance, but Wade was focused on Ezra's eyes, seeing something there that made him uneasy. It was like looking into the eyes of a wolf that had been pretending to be a sheep, not out of fear, but out of choice. Are you threatening one of my boys, old man? Wade's voice had lost some of its mockery, replaced by something harder. No threats, Ezra replied. Just experience talking. The kind that comes from seeing too many young men die because they drew iron, when they should have drawn wisdom. Martha moved behind the bar, her hand sliding beneath the counter where she kept a scattergun. She'd seen enough bar fights to know when one was brewing, but this felt different. The tension wasn't hot and angry. It was cold, calculated, like the space between lightning and thunder. Experience? Wade laughed, but it sounded forced. What experience could a broken-down old man have that's worth anything? Ezra's right hand moved slightly, and for the first time Wade noticed the calluses there. Not the kind you get from farming or ranching, but the kind that come from years of handling a gun. They were the same calluses Wade saw on his own hands every morning. Boys, Ezra said quietly, I'm going to sit down now. Martha's going to bring me my stew. And you're going to let her because deep down, Wade's been asking questions, sending telegrams. By morning, he'll know exactly who you are, who you were. Let him ask, Ezra replied, his voice carrying a weight of years. The answers won't change what's coming. Outside, the town was unusually quiet. Wade and his men had retreated to their rooms above the saloon, and even the usual evening card games had been suspended. Martha Williams had closed early, something she hadn't done in 15 years of running the establishment. Young Jimmy Foster sat on his front porch with his father, watching Ezra's house from across the street. Pa, he asked, is it true what they're saying? About Mr. McCready being some kind of famous lawman? John Foster looked down at his son, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, Jimmy, the most dangerous men are the ones who work hardest to appear harmless. Your mother and I weren't here when the Rangers were cleaning up the territories, but my pa used to tell stories about a man they called Eagle-Eye. Said he could shoot a playing card edge on at 50 paces. At that moment, Wade Harrison was in his room, reading a telegram by lamplight. His face grew darker with each line. Jasper Thorne paced nervously while Timothy Brown sat quietly in the corner, still shaken from the afternoon's events. "Well?" Jasper asked, pausing his pacing. "What do your friends say?" Wade crumpled the telegram, his knuckles white. "They say we've been playing with fire. That old man? He's not just some has-been lawman. He's Eagle Eye McCready, the one who took down the Clayton gang single-handed, the one who cleaned out the Copper Canyon bandits, the one who—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The one who killed my older brother 15 years ago in a shootout in Tombstone." Timothy's head snapped up. "Your brother? You never said anything about—" "Because I didn't know it was him." Wade's fist slammed into the table. "Jack rode with the Clayton gang. I was just a kid when it happened. All these years I thought it was just some nameless ranger who killed him. But it was him. McCready." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The afternoon's humiliation took on a new meaning. It wasn't just an old man standing up to them. It was the legend himself. The man whose name mothers used to scare their children straight, whose reputation had once cleared towns faster than a prairie fire. "So what do we do?" Timothy asked, his young voice betraying his fear. Wade's face hardened into something ugly. "We do what we came here to do. But now it's personal." Back at Ezra's house, Palmer shifted uncomfortably. "They'll come for you. You know that, right?" "They would have anyway," Ezra said, sliding the cleaned revolver into its holster. "Men like that always push until something pushes back. The only difference is now they'll come at night instead of during the day. They'll try to burn me out, most likely." Palmer's hand tightened on his hat. "I can deputize some men, set up a watch." "No." Ezra's voice was firm. "I've spent 5 years in this town trying not to be what I was. If this has to end the old way, I won't have anyone else's blood on my hands. Just make sure the fire wagon is ready and keep people in their homes tonight." As Palmer left, Ezra walked to an old trunk in the corner. Inside, beneath folded blankets and memories he'd tried to forget, lay a gun belt he'd hoped never to wear again. The leather was still supple, well-oiled despite the years. The twin Colts in their holsters seemed to whisper to him of days past, of quick draws and quicker decisions, of lives taken and lives saved. Martha Williams appeared at his door just then, carrying a covered dish. "Brought you some supper," she said, though they both knew it was an excuse. "Heard Wade sent some telegrams. Thought you might want some company while you wait." Ezra smiled, genuinely touched by her concern. "You should be home, Martha. Tonight's not going to be a fit company for a lady." "I've been serving whiskey to cowboys for 20 years, she replied, setting the dish down. "I stopped being a lady a long time ago." She paused, looking at the gun belt in his hands. "Is it true what they say? About you never missing?" "Everyone misses sometimes," Ezra said softly. "The trick is making sure it's not your last shot." He looked up at her, his eyes carrying a sadness that belied his calm demeanor. "Go home, Martha. Lock your doors. Whatever happens tonight, Desert Thistle Valley's going to be different come morning." As Martha reluctantly left, Ezra began his preparations. He moved his rocking chair away from the window, placed water buckets strategically around the house, and loaded extra cartridges. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were appearing in the desert sky. In the growing darkness, he could hear the town settling in for what everyone knew would be a long night. Young Jimmy Foster, ordered inside by his parents, watched from his window as the last light faded from Ezra's house. The old man's porch, usually occupied by his familiar rocking figure, stood empty, a silent sentry awaiting the storm that everyone could feel approaching. Midnight crept over Desert Thistle Valley like a thick blanket, bringing with it an unnatural stillness. The usual sounds of the desert night, coyotes calling, nightbirds hunting, the wind whistling through the canyon, seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The moon hung full and bright, casting sharp shadows across the empty streets. In his darkened house, Ezra McCready sat motionless in a straight-backed chair, positioned away from any windows. His weathered hands rested on the worn grips of his twin Colts, fingers curved naturally around the familiar steel. The tremor that had marked those hands for 5 years was gone now, replaced by the rock-steady grip that had made him a legend. From his vantage point, he could see the approaches to his home through carefully arranged mirrors, an old trick he'd learned during his ranger days. The setup had taken hours to perfect when he'd first moved in, though he'd prayed he'd never need to use it. Now, those mirrors showed him everything. The empty street, the shadows between buildings, even the roof of the general store where someone might try to set up a long shot. Across town, in the back room of the saloon, Wade Harrison was working himself up to a cold rage. The telegram that had revealed Ezra's identity lay crumpled on the floor, but its words burned in his mind. He'd spent the last hour telling Jasper and Timothy stories about his brother Jack, stories he'd kept buried for 15 years. Jack wasn't just some common outlaw, Wade said, his voice thick with whiskey and memory. He had plans. The Clayton gang was just a stepping stone. He was going to build something bigger, something lasting. Then McCready came along, and with 6 shots he destroyed everything. Jasper, normally quick to violence, showed unusual hesitation. Maybe we should ride out, boss, man with that kind of reputation. That reputation is 15 years old, Wade snapped. Look at him now. He's an old man playing at being harmless. All that legend, and he ends up hiding in a dusty little town, pretending to be nothing. That's not the kind of man we need to fear. Timothy Brown sat in the corner, cleaning his gun with shaking hands. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on him like a physical thing. What's the plan? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Wade's smile was cold in the lamplight. Simple. You and Jasper take the back. I'll come in the front. We'll smoke him out. Literally. Man his age, he'll either burn or run. Either way, by sunrise, people will know that legends can die just like anyone else. Sheriff Palmer stood in his office, staring out the window at the silent town. His deputy, young Sam Tucker, waited nervously by the door. Shouldn't we do something, Ka? Tucker asked. We could gather some men, surround the area. And do what? Palmer interrupted. Start a war in the middle of town. Number this is between them now. Our job is to keep civilians safe and handle whatever's left in the morning. He paused, remembering the look in Ezra's eyes earlier. Besides, if half the stories about McCready are true, we'd just be getting in his way. In his bedroom window, Jimmy Foster knelt with his face pressed against the glass, defying his parents' orders to sleep. He'd read every dime novel he could find about the Old West, but this was real. A genuine legend was about to face down the bad guys just like in the stories. Only this didn't feel exciting like in the books. This felt dangerous and sad, like watching an approaching storm that you knew would change everything it touched. Martha Williams sat in her darkened saloon, a loaded shotgun across her lap. She'd refused to go home, positioning herself where she could see both Ezra's house and the room where Wade and his men plotted. Years of running a salon had taught her to read men's intentions, and everything about tonight felt like a powder keg looking for a spark. The first move came just past 1 o'clock. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness behind the saloon, moving with exaggerated care through the quiet streets. They split up at the crossroads, 2 heading down the back alley behind Ezra's house, 1 moving toward the front. In his chair, Ezra watched their approach through his arranged mirrors. His breathing remained steady, his hands still. He'd been in this position more times than he could count, though never with quite so many years weighing on his shoulders. Age had slowed him, he knew that, but it had also taught him patience. The young gun who'd earned the name Eagle Eye might have rushed out to meet them. The old man he'd become knew the value of waiting. Wade carried a small barrel of kerosene, stolen from behind the general store. Jasper and Timothy each held bundles of oil-soaked rags. Their plan was simple: surround the house, start fires at the corners, and wait for the old man to either burn or run. They hadn't counted on the mirrors, hadn't noticed the carefully positioned water buckets, hadn't realized that every approach to the house had been mapped out years ago by a man who'd spent his life planning for moments exactly like this. The night air carried the first hint of kerosene smell. Through his mirrors, Ezra watched Wade's shape move past the front window, saw Jasper's shadow in the back, and caught the nervous shuffle of Timothy's feet at the side of the house. His right hand moved slightly, adjusting his grip on the Colt. "Last chance, boys," he said softly, though they couldn't hear him. "Walk away now, or learn why they used to call me Eagle Eye." The first match flared in the darkness, its small light reflecting off a dozen hidden mirrors, creating a constellation of tiny stars around the house. The time for waiting was over. Whatever happened next would become part of Desert Thistle Valley's history, assuming anyone was left to tell the tale. The match arced through the night air, trailing orange light like a falling star. Before it could touch the kerosene-soaked wood of Ezra's porch, a single shot rang out. The match disappeared, struck in mid-flight, leaving only a trace of smoke and the sharp smell of phosphorus in the air. "That's one," Ezra's voice carried clearly in the night air. "I've got 11 more in these guns. Who wants the second?" Wade froze, the empty matchbox falling from his suddenly numb fingers. He'd heard stories of shots like that, impossible shots that defied explanation, but hearing stories was different from seeing a match shot out of the air in the dark. "Spread out," Wade hissed to his companions. "He can't watch all sides at once." But Ezra's voice came again, calm as a summer morning. "Timothy's behind the water barrel to the east. Jasper's crouching by Martha's rose bush to the west. And you, Wade, you're standing exactly 17 steps from my front door, thinking about that second match in your vest pocket." In his hiding spot, Timothy's breath caught. He hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't made a sound, but somehow the old man knew exactly where he was. Stories of Eagle Eye McCready's legendary perception began to seem less like tall tales and more like warnings they should have heeded. 15 years is a long time to carry hate, Wade, Ezra continued, still unseen in the darkness of his house. "Your brother made his choice when he rode with the Clayton gang, just like you're making yours now." Wade's face contorted with rage. "You don't get to talk about my brother. You don't get to hide in there and pretend you're still the man you were." He pulled his revolver, firing 3 quick shots through the front window. The sound of breaking glass hadn't even faded when 2 shots answered. Not from the window, but from somewhere else entirely. Wade's gun went spinning into the dirt, his hand numbed by the precision shot that had struck the weapon itself. At the same moment, Timothy yelped as his own gun was shot cleanly from his grasp. "That's 4, Ezra counted calmly. 8 left. Want to try for the rest of your weapons, or should we have a real conversation?" Jasper, panicking, broke from his cover and ran for the street, firing wildly at the house. His first shot went wide, his second splintered a porch post, and his third never came. Ezra's response was swift. 3 more shots in rapid succession. The first knocked Jasper's gun away, the second cut his gun belt clean off, and the third splintered the boardwalk at his feet, stopping him in his tracks. 7 left, Ezra announced, though I should mention I've got 2 more fully loaded guns within reach. Numbers were never really your strong suit, were they, Wade? He never even got close. Ezra's final shot knocked the hidden gun away before Wade's fingers could close around it, the bullet striking with such precision that it left Wade's hand unharmed, but his sleeve pinned to the ground. As Sheriff Palmer and his deputy finally approached, drawn by the gunfire, Ezra holstered his weapons. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, and not a single person had died. Every shot had been placed with the precision of a surgeon, designed to disarm and disable rather than kill. Young Jimmy Foster, watching from his window, had counted every shot. He'd just witnessed something he'd only read about in dime novels, the kind of shooting that turned men into legends. But what impressed him most wasn't the accuracy of the shots, but the restraint behind them. Eagle Eye McCready hadn't just shown them how well he could shoot. He'd shown them why he'd earned the right to stop. The sunrise that painted Desert Thistle Valley in shades of gold seemed to mock the tension still hanging in the air. Sheriff Palmer's men led Wade Harrison and Timothy Brown to the jail, their procession watched by townspeople who'd emerged from their homes like prairie dogs after a storm. But this storm, they would soon learn, was just the beginning. Martha Williams stood in her saloon's doorway, watching telegraph operator Charlie Watson running from person to person, sharing the morning's incoming messages. The night's events weren't staying quiet. They were spreading across the territory faster than a prairie fire. Ezra McCready sat in his usual rocking chair, but his eyes weren't closed in their customary morning rest. Instead, they scanned the horizon with the sharp attention of a man who knew that fame attracted trouble, like honey attracted bears. His hands had their familiar tremor, but now and then they would steady completely, especially when his gaze caught movement at the edge of town. 3 telegrams all ready this morning, Sheriff Palmer said, climbing the steps to Ezra's porch. 2 from newspapermen in Santa Fe and 1 from the territorial marshal's office. He paused, watching Ezra's reaction. Words getting out about how the legendary Eagle Eye McCready disarmed 3 men with 11 perfect shots in the dark. 12 shots. Ezra corrected quietly. The last one's still in my gun. Sometimes the shots you don't take matter more than the ones you do. Before Palmer could respond, young Jimmy Foster came running up, clutching a handful of spent cartridge cases he'd collected from the previous night. His eyes shone with excitement, but there was something else there too. A hunger for knowledge that Ezra recognized all too well. "Mr. McCready," Jimmy started, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared at the edge of town, their intentions clear in the way they carried themselves, gun hands looking to make names for themselves. The first vultures, drawn by the scent of legend. "Jimmy," Ezra said softly, "run tell your mother you'll be late for supper. Then go to Martha's and help her close up the saloon." His eyes never left the approaching riders, and his hands had gone completely steady. In the jail, Timothy Brown pressed against the bars, watching the scene unfold through the window. Unlike Wade, who sat in sullen silence, Timothy's mind was racing. He'd seen something last night that changed him. Not just the shooting, but the mercy behind it. Every shot is designed to disarm, not destroy. It was a revelation that made him question everything he thought he knew about strength. "Sheriff," he called out as Palmer returned to the jail, "I want to make a deal." Meanwhile, Martha Williams was doing more than just closing her saloon. She was writing rapidly in a leather-bound journal, recording everything she'd witnessed. She'd been keeping chronicles of Desert Thistle Valley for 15 years, but never had she felt more like a historian than now. Something was changing in their quiet town, and she meant to document every detail. The 3 riders split up as they entered the town proper, taking positions that wouldn't have meant anything to most observers. But Ezra saw it all. The way they placed themselves to cover each other's blind spots, the practiced ease with which they kept their shooting hands free. These weren't common troublemakers. These were professionals. "Might want to clear the street," Ezra called out, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. A few townspeople were still watching from doorways and windows. Some folks are about to make poor decisions. The lead rider, a man in a black duster with silver conchos down the sleeves, reined his horse to a stop in the center of the street. "You McCready?" he called out. "Eagle Eye McCready?" "Depends," Ezra replied, not moving from his chair. "If you're looking for the legend, he died a long time ago. If you're looking for trouble, you might want to reconsider. Had my fill of that last night." "Name's Carson Malone," the rider announced. "Made quite a reputation myself down in Mexico. Thought I'd come see if the stories about you were true." His hand hovered near his gun. "They say you can shoot a playing card edge-on at 50 paces. "They say a lot of things," Ezra responded. "Most of them are best left in the past." But even as he spoke, a telegraph operator was receiving another message, this one from a name that made his face go pale. He rushed out of his office, the paper clutched in his trembling hand, looking for the sheriff. The message was brief, but carried the weight of history. "Confirmed sighting Eagle Eye McCready. Stop Victor Deadeye. McGrath released from Yuma prison 3 days ago. Stop, swore revenge, Stop, heading your way, stop. The morning sun continued to climb, casting shorter shadows across Desert Thistle Valley. But longer shadows were gathering, shadows of the past, of reputation, of choices made, and prices yet to be paid. The legend of Eagle-Eye McCready wasn't ending. It was being reborn, and with it would come both glory and grief, redemption and revenge. Carson Malone's reputation wasn't just talk. 3 notches on his gun had been earned in a single afternoon in Nogales, and his speed was whispered about in saloons from El Paso to Tombstone. But as he faced Ezra McCready across the sun-baked street of Desert Thistle Valley, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. "Last chance to walk away, son," Ezra said, still seated in his rocking chair. "There's no glory in challenging an old man, and no wisdom in pushing one who doesn't want to fight." Malone's 2 companions had taken positions at opposite ends of the street. The one in the brown vest was named Tucker Reed, known for his trick shots in Kansas City. The other, a lean man with a scarred face who called himself simply the Priest, had a warrant out for him in 3 territories. Inside the jail, Timothy Brown pressed against the bars. "Sheriff, you've got to let me talk to them. I know Tucker Reed, ran with him once. Maybe I can stop this before it starts." Palmer studied the young man thoughtfully. The change in Timothy since last night was remarkable, as if seeing true skill and mercy combined had awakened something in him. "Start talking," Palmer said. Meanwhile, Martha Williams had ushered Jimmy Foster into her saloon, but the boy wouldn't move away from the window. "Miss Martha," he whispered, "look at Mr. McCready's hands. They're not shaking anymore." Indeed, Ezra's hands were steady as stone as he slowly rose from his chair. His movements had none of the hesitation or trembling that the town had grown used to seeing. Each step down from his porch was measured and precise. "Tell me something, Mr. Malone," Ezra called out. "Those 3 notches on your gun, were any of them earned face-to-face, or did you shoot them all in the back like you're planning to do here?" Malone's face flushed red. His companions shifted uneasily. They hadn't told anyone about their plan to take positions for a crossfire, yet somehow the old man knew. "Been watching you since you split up at the edge of town," Ezra continued. "Reed's got his rifle hidden under that blanket, thinking he'll get a shot from the livery roof. Your friend in black's been checking his Derringer every 30 seconds, nervous about it misfiring like it did in Prescott last month." He paused, letting his words sink in. A man who spends his life watching for trouble gets good at seeing the signs. In the jail, Timothy's voice was urgent. "Sheriff, Reed's got a hair trigger on that rifle. He gets nervous. He's likely to shoot even if Malone calls it off. Let me help." "Please." Palmer made a decision. He quickly unlocked Timothy's cell. "One wrong move," he warned, "and you'll wish you'd stayed behind bars." Outside, Malone's composure was cracking. Everything about this was wrong. The old man shouldn't know all these details. Shouldn't be so calm. Shouldn't be making him feel like a child being lectured. "Enough talk," Malone snarled, his right hand twitching near his gun. "Son," Ezra said softly, "your tell is in your left boot. It shifts just before you draw. Might want to work on that if you live through this morning's foolishness." The words had barely left his mouth when Malone went for his gun. His draw was fast, blindingly fast to most men's eyes. But Ezra's hands moved with the liquid grace of decades of experience. 2 shots rang out almost as one. Malone's gun went spinning away, knocked cleanly from his grip. He stared in disbelief at his unharmed hand, then at his weapon lying in the dust 6 feet away. The priest, seeing his leader disarmed, made his move. His Derringer appeared in his hand and promptly fell apart, its main pin shot out with surgical precision. He hadn't even seen Ezra's second shot. On the livery roof, Reed was lining up his rifle shot when a familiar voice called out, "Tucker, don't do it." Timothy Brown stood in the street, hands raised. "This isn't some ranch hand you're drawing on. This is Eagle-Eye McCready. He's already got you dead to rights." Reed's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed as he processed Timothy's words. He knew Timothy, trusted him even. "How dead?" he called back. "Look at your rifle sight." Ezra answered. Reed did, and his blood ran cold. The front sight of his rifle had been shot clean off, with such precision that he hadn't even felt the weapon jump in his hands. A shot like that, in the bright morning sun, at that angle, through that distance, it shouldn't have been possible. That's 3 shots you didn't hear, Ezra announced, because I fired them while you were all watching Malone's gun hit the dirt. Now, we can end this here, with wounded pride and valuable lessons, or we can see what other impossible shots an old man can make before breakfast. Malone slowly raised his hands. They said you were something special. But this... He shook his head. This is something else. No, Ezra corrected. This is what happens when a man spends 50 years learning how to stop trouble without taking lives. Fancy shooting? That's just a tool. The real skill is in knowing how to use it right. As the would-be challengers gathered their damaged weapons and wounded pride, Timothy Brown felt Sheriff Palmer's hand on his shoulder. That was good work, son. Quick thinking. Just trying to stop more blood from spilling, Timothy replied. Seems I learned something last night after all. But even as the morning's excitement died down, more riders were appearing on the horizon. News of Eagle Eye McCready's return to action was spreading, and with it came every gunslinger looking to make a name for himself. And somewhere, in a camp 3 days' ride away, Victor Deadeye McGrath was cleaning his custom-made revolvers. His thoughts focused on the man who'd put him in Yuma prison 15 years ago. The man who'd shot him in both hands, ending his reign of terror, but leaving him alive. A mercy that McGrath had spent every day since then cursing. The afternoon sun beat down on Desert Thistle Valley as Timothy Brown stood in Sheriff Palmer's office, his former cell door standing open behind him. After helping defuse the morning's confrontation, he'd earned a measure of trust, but the real test was yet to come. I want to make things right, Timothy said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Mr. McCready showed me something yesterday. Showed all of us something. There's a better way than violence. Palmer leaned back in his chair, studying the young man. Fine words, but Wade Harrison's still sitting in that cell, probably planning revenge. Why should I believe you're any different? Before Timothy could answer, Ezra McCready stepped into the office, his boots dusty from his morning walk. Because he stepped into the street to save a life today, Ezra said. Takes more courage to stop a bullet than to fire one. The old gunslinger's presence seemed to fill the small office. Even Palmer found himself sitting straighter. In the light streaming through the window, they could see the silver threading through Ezra's hair, but also the sharp alertness in his eyes that never seemed to fade. Sir, Timothy began, then stopped, gathering his thoughts. The way you handled those shots last night, every bullet placed to disarm, not destroy. I've never seen anything like it. Never even thought it was possible. Possible isn't the same as easy, Ezra replied. Takes years of practice to shoot well enough to avoid killing. Takes even longer to learn when not to shoot at all. He paused, studying Timothy's face. But you're young enough to learn, if you're willing to put in the work. Outside, young Jimmy Foster was sweeping Martha's saloon porch, trying to stay close to where the action was. He'd appointed himself unofficial watchman, keeping an eye out for more trouble riding into town. The morning's excitement had drawn quite a crowd, and Martha's place was doing good business despite the early hour. 3 more just rode in, Jimmy called out, his voice carrying through the sheriff's office window. Look like cowhands, but they're riding war saddles. Ezra's hands steadied immediately, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned to Timothy. Tell me what you see in them, son. Look close like I taught you this morning. Timothy moved to the window, trying to see what Ezra saw. The one in front, his gun's too new. Probably bought it special for this trip. The tall one's favoring his right leg, old injury maybe. And the third, he squinted. The third keeps looking at the telegraph office instead of us. Good eye, Ezra nodded. They're not here for trouble. They're here for information. Probably working for someone else. The question is who? Palmer joined them at the window. McGrath? He asked quietly. Maybe, Ezra replied. Victor always did like to know what he was riding into. Used to send men ahead to scout his targets back before I put him in Yuma. The name sent a chill through the office. Victor Deadeye McGrath wasn't just another gunslinger. He was a legend in his own right, though a darker one than Ezra. Where Ezra had used his skills to protect, McGrath had used his to terrorize. Their final confrontation 15 years ago had become the stuff of legend. Tell me about him, Timothy said. If he's coming, I want to help. I need to help. Ezra settled into a chair, his movements deliberate. Victor McGrath was the kind of man who gave gunslingers a bad name. Didn't just kill, he enjoyed it. I like to make examples of people. Town marshal in Tucson, family man, good at his job. Then something broke in him. Started using his badge as an excuse for murder. Martha Williams appeared in the doorway carrying a pot of coffee. She'd heard enough to know this was a story that needed telling. As she poured cups for everyone, Ezra continued. I was called in after he'd killed 3 families, claiming they were harboring criminals. No proof, no trials, just graves. When I caught up to him, he tried to shoot a young girl to distract me. That's when I put bullets through both his hands. Not to kill him, but to make sure he'd never hold a gun again. But he learned anyway, Palmer added. Taught himself to shoot all over again in prison, they say. Spent 15 years practicing with makeshift weapons, training his mangled hands to hold a gun. Timothy absorbed this information, his face grave. And now he's coming here. For revenge. Not just revenge, Ezra corrected. Vindication. He wants to prove that his way, the way of violence and death, is stronger than what I stand for, and he'll kill anyone he needs to in order to make that point. Jimmy, who had crept closer to listen, spoke up from the doorway. But you'll stop him, won't you, Mr. McCready? Like you stopped Wade and the others. Ezra's face showed a sadness that hadn't been there before. It's not that simple, son. McGrath isn't like these young guns looking to make a name. He's had 15 years to plan this, 15 years of hatred to fuel him, and he's not coming alone. As if to emphasize his point, one of the newly arrived riders entered the telegraph office. Through the window, they could see him sending a message, no doubt reporting back to his employer about the morning's events. I want to learn, Timothy said suddenly. Everything you can teach me, not just about shooting, but about seeing things the way you do, about stopping trouble before it starts. Ezra studied him for a long moment. Learning to shoot like I do would take years. We might have days, maybe less. Then teach me what you can, Timothy insisted. I've done wrong in my life, followed men like Wade without thinking. Let me try to make it right. Outside, the 3 riders mounted up and headed out of town, their real purpose accomplished. They'd seen what they came to see. That Eagle-Eye McCready wasn't just a legend, but very much a living, breathing threat to their employer's plans. The afternoon stretched on, the shadow of impending confrontation growing longer with each passing hour. In his cell, Wade Harrison smiled, knowing that bigger storms were gathering. But in the sheriff's office, something else was taking shape. The beginning of redemption, the passing of knowledge, and the formation of allies for the battles to come. The next morning brought a cold wind from the north, unusual for the season. Martha Williams found her wind chimes clattering with an ominous rhythm as she opened the saloon. The town had changed in just 2 days. Armed men walking the streets, visitors filling every room, and a tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. At the edge of town, Ezra McCready was conducting an unusual lesson. Timothy Brown stood facing a row of bottles on a fence, his gun hand steady but his frustration evident. For an hour he'd been trying to hit the bottles without breaking them, just nudging them off the fence the way Ezra had demonstrated. You're still trying to dominate the gun, Ezra said, watching Timothy's stance. It's not about power. It's about precision, Timothy finished. Balance, control, but my shots either miss completely or shatter the bottles. Because you're thinking like the man you were, not the man you're becoming. Ezra stepped forward, adjusting Timothy's arm slightly. When I found my way, it wasn't about learning to shoot better. It was about learning to live better. The shooting followed naturally. Young Jimmy Foster sat cross-legged nearby, watching intently. He'd appointed himself Ezra's unofficial student as well, though he was too young for shooting lessons. Instead, Ezra had been teaching him to observe, to read people and situations the way a tracker reads signs. "Rider coming," Jimmy announced suddenly, pointing east. "Moving fast but trying not to show it." Ezra smiled approvingly. "Good eye. What else?" Jimmy squinted. He's riding like he's scared. Keep looking behind him." The rider turned out to be a young ranch hand named Billy Torres. His horse was lathered, showing signs of hard riding, and his face carried news before his voice could deliver it. "Mr. McCready," he called out, reining in hard. "McGrath's. He hit the Wilson Ranch yesterday. Old man Wilson, his wife. Everyone." The news hit like a physical blow. The Wilsons had been good people, their ranch a regular stop for travelers between towns. More importantly, they'd been friends of Ezra's, offering him shelter when he'd first arrived in the territory 5 years ago. "Tell me everything," Ezra said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "They're saying he lined them all up, ranch hands, family, even the cook. Made them watch as he shot the bottles off the fence posts behind them, showing off his accuracy. Then," Billy's voice cracked. "Then he made his point about what happens to people who help certain retired lawmen." Timothy's face had gone pale. This was the reality of the man they were facing. Not just a killer, but a monster who enjoyed his work. The bottle shooting practice took on a darker meaning now. In town, Sheriff Palmer was organizing a posse, but Ezra knew it wouldn't help. McGrath was sending a message, marking his territory, drawing his prey out. A posse would just give him more targets. "Miss Martha," Jimmy called out as they returned to town. "There's a man in black at the bar, been watching the street all morning." Martha nodded slightly, indicating she knew. The stranger had arrived at dawn, ordered 1 beer, and nursed it while studying everyone who passed. His left hand was heavily scarred, the kind of scars that came from having your hands shot through and healing wrong. "One of McGrath's," Ezra said quietly. "Let him watch. He'll see what we want him to see." Throughout the day, more news trickled in. McGrath's band had grown, picking up hired guns and opportunists as it moved closer to Desert Thistle Valley. They'd hit 2 more homesteads, not for killing this time, but for supplies and information. In his cell, Wade Harrison had grown unusually quiet, listening to the reports with increasing concern. Even he seemed to realize that McGrath's arrival would bring a violence that went beyond anything he'd known. "Timothy," Ezra said that afternoon as they continued their practice, "tomorrow we will try something different. The gun's just a tool. The real weapon is up here." He tapped his temple. "McGrath thinks this is about shooting, about proving who's faster or more accurate. But it's really about choosing who we become." Timothy nodded, understanding flowing through him like a river finding its course. The bottles on the fence weren't just targets, they were choices. Each one represented a moment where violence could be turned aside, where skill could preserve life instead of taking it. As the sun began to set, Jimmy rushed up to Ezra's porch. "Mr. McCready, the stranger in black, he's leaving, but he left something on his table." In Martha's saloon, they found a playing card on the table where the scarred man had sat all day. It was an ace of spades with a message written in precise handwriting. 3 days. For 15 years of darkness. For hands that never healed right. For a mercy that was worse than death. 3 days, then we settle things the old way. And this time, eagle eye, you'll learn that mercy is just another word for weakness. V.M. Ezra read the message twice, then quietly pocketed the card. "Martha, send word to the outlying farms. Anyone who wants to leave should go now. Timothy, tomorrow, we start real training." And Jimmy, Yes, sir? I need you to be my eyes in town. McGrath will send more watchers. We need to know who and where. The boy straightened with pride at the responsibility. You can count on me, Mr. McCready. As night fell over Desert Thistle Valley, lights burned late in windows throughout the town. Some were frightened people making plans to leave. Others were determined folks preparing to stand their ground. But in every pool of lamplight, in every whispered conversation, one question hung in the air. Could even the legendary Eagle Eye McCready stand against a man who'd spent 15 years planning his revenge? The wind chimes at Martha's saloon continued their eerie song, counting down the hours until darkness would finally meet light in the streets of Desert Thistle Valley. Dawn painted Desert Thistle Valley in shades of blood red, the sun rising through dust-laden clouds that promised a storm. 2 days remained until McGrath's deadline, and the town had taken on the atmosphere of a fortress preparing for siege. Sheriff Palmer had deputized a dozen men, though everyone knew they wouldn't stand a chance against what was coming. Watch their hands first, Ezra instructed, standing with Jimmy Foster on the saloon's upper balcony. Hands tell you everything. Tension, fear, intention. See that fellow by the water trough? Jimmy narrowed his eyes, focusing on a dusty traveler who'd just ridden in. His right hand keeps touching his coat pocket, not his gun. Good. What does that tell you? He's carrying something important? A message, maybe? Ezra nodded approvingly. McGrath's scout. Probably has a report to deliver. Notice how he's pretending not to look this way, but his hat brim hasn't moved from this direction? Below them, Timothy Brown was helping Martha Williams board up her ground floor windows, leaving only narrow gaps. The young man had thrown himself into his new role with a dedication that surprised everyone except Ezra. His hands, once quick to violence, now moved with careful purpose. Tell me what you see in Timothy, Ezra said to Jimmy, making every moment a lesson. Jimmy watched the former outlaw work. He's different now. Calmer, but not weak calm like some folks thought you were. Strong calm like you. Strong calm, Ezra repeated thoughtfully. That's a good way to put it. Strength isn't about rider coming, Jimmy interrupted, pointing west. No, 2 riders. 3. More coming. A group of mounted men appeared through the morning haze, but these weren't McGrath's men. Ezra recognized them immediately. Lawmen from neighboring territories, drawn by news of the coming confrontation. Leading them was Marshal John Cooper, a hard-faced man Ezra had known in his ranger days. Should have known you'd show up, John, Ezra called down as the group dismounted. Word's spreading, Cooper replied grimly. McGrath's got nearly 30 riders now, picking up every piece of human debris between here and Yuma. Figure you could use some help. Or you figured this was your chance to end McGrath once and for all? Cooper's weathered face creased in a slight smile. Maybe both. Either way, we're here. Inside the jail, Wade Harrison sat silently in his cell, listening to the increasing activity outside. His face showed conflicting emotions, anger at his situation, fear of what was coming, and something else, something that looked almost like regret. Timothy approached the cell, a cup of coffee in his hand. Brought you something hot. Weather's turning. Wade stared at his former lieutenant. Are you really buying into all this? The old man's philosophy about mercy and precision? McGrath's going to kill everyone in this town just to prove a point. Maybe, Timothy replied. Or maybe you're just scared of what it means if Mr. McCready's right, if there really is a better way than what we chose. The morning wore on, bringing more arrivals. Not all were welcome. Martha spotted 3 known gunmen taking rooms, their allegiance uncertain. Jimmy, from his various observation posts, counted 12 potential threats by noon. Each one was noted, their positions marked on a map in the sheriff's office. McGrath's not just sending scouts, Ezra explained to Timothy during their afternoon practice. He's positioning pieces on the board. Some of these men will join him when he arrives. Others are here to block escape routes to make sure his revenge is complete. Timothy had finally managed to knock a bottle off the fence without breaking it. But why wait? Why give us time to prepare? Because this isn't just about killing me, Ezra replied, his eyes scanning the street as they talked. It's about destroying everything I stand for. He wants to prove that mercy is weakness, that his way of violence is the only way, and he wants witnesses. As if to emphasize his point, another group of writers appeared, journalists from as far as San Francisco, drawn by the promise of a legendary confrontation. Marshal Cooper's men turned them away at the town limits, but everyone knew they'd find ways to watch what was coming. Jimmy burst into the sheriff's office late that afternoon, his young face serious. Mr. McCready, one of McGrath's men, was asking Martha about Wade Harrison, asked if he was still in jail. Ezra's expression darkened. He headed to the jail, finding Timothy already there, standing guard. Wade looked up as they entered, understanding dawning on his face. "He's going to try to break me out, isn't he?" Wade asked. "Use the chaos to free me. Expect me to join his side." "Would you?" Ezra asked directly. Wade was silent for a long moment. 2 days ago, I would have. Now, I've seen what real skill looks like, real strength. McGrath's just a rabid dog with a grudge. The wind picked up as evening approached, carrying the smell of rain. Martha's wind chimes sang their warning song as dark clouds gathered over Desert Thistle Valley. In his room, Jimmy carefully maintained his list of suspicious visitors, marking their locations with a child's determination. Timothy practiced with his gun in the fading light, each shot more controlled than the last, and Ezra McCready sat on his porch, watching the gathering storm with eyes that saw more than most men could imagine. His hands were steady now, the tremor gone as if it had never existed. In 2 days he would face not just a deadly enemy but a philosophical opposite, a man who represented everything he had spent his life standing against. "Mr. McCready," Jimmy called from across the street. "Wire just came in. McGrath hit another town, left a message written in. It's all right, son. Say it. Written in blood on the saloon wall. 2 days until the eagle falls." The wind chimes chattered more urgently as the storm clouds thickened. Desert Thistle Valley held its breath, caught between the coming storm and the growing legend of its defender. But legends, as every man, woman, and child in town was about to learn, are written in blood as often as glory. The final morning dawned gray and cold, with thunder rolling in the distance. Shadow Creek Valley had never been so quiet. No children playing in the streets, no wagons moving goods, no morning gossip at Martha's saloon. Only armed men positioned at windows and doorways, watching the horizon. Jimmy Foster's young voice broke the silence first. "Dust cloud to the east. Big one." From his position on the saloon's roof, Timothy Brown raised a spyglass. The past 2 days of intense training under Ezra had changed him. His movements were measured now, his eyes constantly scanning like his mentor had taught him. "At least 30 riders," he reported. "McGrath's in front. Can't mistake those silver-plated guns." Ezra McCready stood on his porch, seemingly relaxed despite the approaching threat. His hands were steady as he adjusted his gun belt. Not the worn, everyday leather he'd used recently, but his old Ranger rig, restored to perfect condition. "Timothy," he called out. "Remember what we discussed. No heroics. Your job is to protect Martha's place and the people inside. Jimmy, get to your post at the telegraph office. Keep that line to the marshal's office open." Marshal Cooper approached, his deputies spreading out behind him. "Last chance to do this differently, Ezra. We've got enough guns now to meet them head on. And turn the whole town into a killing field?" Ezra shook his head. "Number McGrath wants me. Everything else is just his attempt to prove a point about violence and mercy." A lone rider broke away from the approaching cloud, moving ahead of the main group. Even at a distance, the man's presence commanded attention. Victor McGrath had changed during his 15 years in Yuma prison. His once dark hair had gone steel gray, and his hands, even from a distance, showed the twisted evidence of old injuries. He reined his horse to a stop at the edge of town. "Come out, Eagle Eye." His voice boomed across the empty street. "Come see what 15 years of practice can do." Ezra stepped off his porch, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each deliberate step, I see prison didn't improve your manners, Victor. McGrath's laugh was harsh. But it did improve my aim. Want to see? His gun seemed to materialize in his mangled hand, and 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. 3 bottles on the saloon's porch rail exploded, the same kind of trick shot Ezra had been teaching Timothy, but done with brutal force rather than precision. Still think mercy is strength, old man? Still think there's room for kindness in a world of lead and gunpowder? I think, Ezra replied calmly, that you spent 15 years learning the wrong lesson. Behind McGrath, his riders began spreading out, taking positions around the town's perimeter. Among them were faces Timothy recognized, gunmen who'd been filtering into town over the past 2 days, now showing their true allegiance. In the jail, Wade Harrison stood at his cell door, watching through the window. Sheriff Palmer had offered to free him, expecting trouble, but Wade had chosen to stay. Some things, he'd said, you need to see through to the end. Before we start this dance, McGrath called out, I have a few points to make. He raised his gun again, aiming at the hotel's upper window where a woman was barely visible. About the price of helping lawmen. The shot never came. Instead, McGrath's gun went spinning from his grip, knocked away by a shot so fast few had seen Ezra draw. But McGrath smiled, switching to his second gun with his other twisted hand. Good, still fast. But are you fast enough to stop all of us? As if on signal, several of McGrath's men raised their weapons, not at Ezra, but at various townspeople visible in windows and doorways. Martha Williams, Timothy, Marshal Cooper's men, and even young Jimmy at his telegraph post became targets. You see, McGrath continued, this is the lesson about mercy I learned in prison. It's not just weakness, it's a chain. You care about these people. That makes them weapons I can use against you. Thunder rolled closer as McGrath retrieved his fallen gun. So here's how this ends. You and me will have our dance. But first, I'm going to prove my point. Every person you ever showed mercy to, everyone you ever taught your precious lessons to, they'll learn that mercy gets you killed. Ezra's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. Timothy, show them what you learned about mercy and strength. Still think mercy is strength, old man? Still think there's room for kindness in a world of lead and gunpowder? I think, Ezra replied calmly, that you spent 15 years learning the wrong lesson. Behind McGrath, his riders began spreading out, taking positions around the town's perimeter. Among them were faces Timothy recognized, gunmen who'd been filtering into town over the past 2 days, now showing their true allegiance. In the jail, Wade Harrison stood at his cell door, watching through the window. Sheriff Palmer had offered to free him, expecting trouble, but Wade had chosen to stay. Some things, he'd said, you need to see through to the end. Before we start this dance, McGrath called out, I have a few points to make. He raised his gun again, aiming at the hotel's upper window where a woman was barely visible. About the price of helping lawmen. The shot never came. Instead, McGrath's gun went spinning from his grip, knocked away by a shot so fast few had seen Ezra draw. But McGrath smiled, switching to his second gun with his other twisted hand. Good, still fast. But are you fast enough to stop all of us? As if on signal, several of McGrath's men raised their weapons, not at Ezra, but at various townspeople visible in windows and doorways. Martha Williams, Timothy, Marshal Cooper's men, and even young Jimmy at his telegraph post became targets. You see, McGrath continued, this is the lesson about mercy I learned in prison. It's not just weakness. It's a chain. You care about these people. That makes them weapons I can use against you. Thunder rolled closer as McGrath retrieved his fallen gun. So here's how this ends. You and me will have our dance. But first, I'm going to prove my point. Every person you ever showed mercy to, everyone you ever taught your precious lessons to, they'll learn that mercy gets you killed. Ezra's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. Timothy, show them what you learned about mercy and strength. long enough to realize there might be a better way. McGrath's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Better way? Look around, old man. Look what your better way has brought. A town full of targets, all because you didn't have the stomach to finish things properly 15 years ago. The rain intensified, and with it came McGrath's signal. His men opened fire, not at Ezra, but at the windows where the townspeople and lawmen waited. The air filled with gun smoke and the crack of rifles. But something unexpected happened. Instead of chaos, instead of panic, the town responded with precision. Timothy Brown's voice rang out from the saloon roof, directing return fire with surgical accuracy. Every shot from the defenders was aimed to disable, not kill, just as Ezra had taught. Impossible! McGrath snarled as he watched his men's weapons get shot from their hands one by one. Nobody's that accurate. Nobody can... His words cut off as Ezra's first shot knocked one of his silver guns away. But McGrath's second gun was already moving, firing at the saloon where Timothy stood exposed. The young man didn't flinch. Instead, his return fire caught McGrath's bullet in midair with a spark of colliding lead that lit up the rain-soaked street. It was the kind of shot that seemed impossible. The kind of shot Ezra had spent days teaching him. You see, Victor, Ezra's voice carried clearly, despite the storm. While you were learning to hate better, I was teaching others to live better. Every person you threatened, every life you tried to use against me, they've learned what you never could. Jimmy's voice cut through the chaos from his position. Mr. McCready, 3 trying to circle behind through the alley. Marshal Cooper's men moved to intercept, their shots precise and controlled. No killing shots, no wild firing, just careful disarmament, every bullet placed with purpose. McGrath's face contorted with rage. You think this proves anything? That mercy makes you stronger? I'll show you what strength really is. He raised his remaining gun, but not at Ezra, at young Jimmy Foster in the telegraph office window. The next few seconds seemed to stretch like molasses. McGrath's gun barked once, the muzzle flashed bright in the rain, but 3 shots answered it simultaneously, one from Ezra, one from Timothy, and one from Wade Harrison, who had somehow gotten hold of a rifle in his cell. All 3 shots struck McGrath's bullet in mid-flight, the combined impact turning it to harmless lead dust before it could reach Jimmy. It was the kind of coordinated shot that shouldn't have been possible, the kind that would be talked about for generations. McGrath stared in disbelief, his gun hand shaking. How did the boy... Because I taught them all, Ezra replied quietly. Every person in this town learned what real strength is. Even Wade Harrison in his cell learned there's more power in protecting life than taking it. The rain began to slacken as McGrath's men, those still conscious, threw down their weapons. They'd watched their bullets get knocked out of the air, their carefully planned attack fall apart against precision they'd never seen before. But McGrath wasn't finished. With a roar of pure hatred, he drew a hidden derringer. Mercy is weakness, he screamed, firing at Ezra's heart. The old lawman didn't even draw. Instead, he caught the bullet in his bare hand, a move so smooth, so impossible, that even Timothy gasped. As he opened his palm, the flattened bullet fell harmlessly into the mud. No, Ezra said softly. Mercy is the hardest strength of all, because it means having the power to take life, but choosing something better. McGrath's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the muddy street. 15 years of hatred, of planning, of believing in the power of violence, all undone by a demonstration of skill so far beyond mere gunplay that it bordered on miraculous. Do it then, McGrath whispered. Finish it. Prove I was right about mercy being weakness. Ezra finally drew his gun, but not to fire. Instead, he dropped it in the mud between them. No, Victor. I'm going to show you one last time what real strength is. He turned his back on McGrath, walking away. McGrath's hand inched toward the fallen gun, trembling. The whole town held its breath. But before his twisted fingers could close around the grip, he stopped. For the first time in 15 years, he saw clearly what Ezra had been trying to teach him all along. The sun broke through the clouds as McGrath was led away by Marshal Cooper's men. Timothy climbed down from his position, and Jimmy emerged from the telegraph office. Martha Williams stood in her doorway, a proud smile on her face. "Mr. McCready," Jimmy called out, running up to his mentor. "That bullet catch. Will you teach me that too?" Ezra smiled, ruffling the boy's wet hair. "Someday, Jimmy. But first you need to learn what that catch really meant. It wasn't about stopping the bullet. It was about having the strength to face darkness without becoming dark yourself." As the town began to stir back to life, Wade Harrison called out from his cell window. "Hey, McCready." That offer to learn. "Does it still stand for old fools who learned their lesson late?" "It stands for anyone willing to learn," Ezra replied. "That's what I've been trying to teach all along. It's never too late to choose a better way." The legend of Eagle Eye McCready didn't end that day in Desert Thistle Valley. Instead, it transformed into something greater. A story not just about a man's skill with a gun, but about the power of mercy to change lives. His legacy lived on through Timothy, through Jimmy, through every person who learned that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. And if you pass through Desert Thistle Valley in the years that followed, you might see an old man teaching young gunslingers a different way, not just how to shoot straight, but how to live right. Some say his hand still trembled except when he was showing mercy to those who least deserved it. And in that tremor was the greatest lesson of all, that the hardest battles we face are not against others, but against the darkness within ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.